come to the final part of our meeting where the wonderful Andy Stanfield will give his presentation, The Structural Elements of Poetry. So get your pen and paper out because you're going to learn some good stuff. Thank you very much. Come on, Andy.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me to speak today. If I'm limping, it rained a lot Wednesday and the floor was wet, so I've got a sprained ankle, so bear with me. And I'm running on about 4 hours sleep. Yesterday, I think I did 14 or so hours of academic assessment into the year annual report. And on a lighter note, I realized I don't think any child ever has said, I want to grow up and be an assessment. It was just something that's never happened. But what I'd like to do is talk about poetry, but I would also like to talk about literary criticism and how we can combine these two to improve our own writing. And when I'm talking about writing, I'm not just talking about poetry, because I think the poetic elements, when you get away from rhyme, that's the quickest way to get out of genre into more literary fiction, because you're focusing more on the beauty of the language. That's, to me, one of the most important things. I think a lot of times especially when I was first writing fiction, I was focused much more on just getting it out there and getting it said, but was it the best way? Were there better and more beautiful ways of expressing myself? So a lot of times what I want to do is take my time, I want to step back, and I want to be my own worst critic. Now, a lot of times when people are first writing poetry, I think it's inspiration. I know for years my main thing was it pops out. You have a feeling and emotion that's so strong that it almost takes on a life of its own. But the longer I do this and the more I get into poetry, what fascinates me most is design and focused and trying to achieve a mood or an effect without inspiration. Because sometimes, I know in my past when I was seeking inspiration, sometimes we do things we shouldn't, and sometimes that can be a negative thing. So how can we be inspired without pushing ourselves to do things? You know what I'm talking about. So the elements of poetry that I think are so very important, they're away from the most obvious. And what's the most obvious to you? What do you think of when you think of poetry? Rhyme. And rhyme is great. Dr. Seuss rhymes, Hallmark cards rhyme. But think about this. Oral cultures, and if you're thinking more, and I don't want to say primitive, but more oftentimes people without a written language. How do you pass on information? It's going to be rhyming stories where you know when to plant, what animals to hunt, what might poison you, right? And so that's how people remember things, were the long rhyming songs and poems, prayers, things like that. What was that?
The Iliad.
Yeah, exactly. And so when I'm writing songs, I want them to rhyme because I want everybody in the crowd to remember the chorus. But if I'm doing poetry, the more I get into it, I'm very fascinated with the things that don't have to do with rhyme. Imagery. How can you come up with an image that's going to be so striking that's going to stand out in their minds? The beauty of the sounds themselves. And if we think about poetry is probably one of the earliest human forms of expression. You know, we may have drummed before that, but as soon as we had language, we're playing around with words. And so this is a primal part of who we are, is the rhythm, the expression of it. So when I'm interested in coming up with a new poem by design, that can be of an entirely different approach. It was almost like Cindy was saying, the what if. And you're posing questions and you're trying to take oftentimes information that doesn't go together and try to combine it in new forms to try to create inspiration. So the rhythms are very powerful. And a lot of times, even if I'm working on an essay or something, I find myself counting beats, right? And you're figuring out what the flow is and how is it going to be most rhythmic and pulling people in almost hypnotically. So I am always focused on revision, because I always say if I want someone to read something more than once, I probably need to write it more than once. And so that brings me to the part of poetry where we're getting away from the inspiration. I know when I was first getting into it, what I would do most, I would write something and I was so happy I did it. And I didn't want to hear criticism. because criticizing my poem was criticizing me, right? But how can we take that initial inspiration and writing out what we did and we think it's perfect, but we put it down? And then we come back and we look at it with critical eyes. I always say I'm going to be my own worst critic because I don't want any of you to be, right? I'm going to look at it so harshly. And to me, that's where the literary criticism comes in so helpful, because by understanding the different ways others may read your work, it may give you opportunities to look and reflect when you're editing in different ways. How might an environmentalist, how might someone who is into history or biography read your work from, LGBTQ, Marxist perspectives, all these things? I write something, and caveat, I'm a white Southern male from Alabama. I may have my own biases, right? And so by stepping back and using these critical approaches, I can hopefully look at myself differently and try to see it as another might read it. And I think that's important, getting out of your head, right? Because if we're truly trying to connect with others, and it's not merely about expressing a good or a bad day, then we're going to think very differently, and we're going to be our own best critics, worst critics, because did we say it in a way that's going to touch people, that's going to move them, that's going to inspire them? So if you may have that inspiration where it comes out like a fire, but can you step back and coldly see what was maybe passion, what was very superfluous, what could be improved? So those things are important. Rhyme, rhythm, imagery, the sounds themselves. And so even if you're writing fiction, what I'm constantly encouraging people, when you write that first draft, go back and just cut and shred and take out words, because I think oftentimes we try to be too clear, especially with dialogue, right? People rarely talk in the complete sentences, so if you're cutting out things, maybe you're creating more work for the readers, which they're really going to enjoy. Have you ever read something and it was so straightforward that you grew bored? It didn't require anything of you. So a lot of times I even bring in random elements, and I'll maybe pull out the old Dungeons and Dragons dice and come out with words in a book and random things, and then suddenly I created depth, right? It's something people may think twice about. And you can create, I think, situations where you're forcing people to ponder and reflect in different ways, and bringing in those random elements are a great way of doing it. Now, when we think about poetry, a lot of times what we're thinking about are these structural elements, and that was the original focus of this speech. But the structural elements, once again, rhyme, rhythm, the poetic form, is it a haiku? Is it some sort of open form where it's complete freedom and you can't get it wrong? Those, from a literary criticism perspective, that's formalism, right? It's the formal structures of the poem. And going to college in Alabama in the 1980s, it's always a little bit behind. So it was almost more of the 1950s approach of looking purely at the work itself rather than bringing in history, biography, any of the isms that we use now to really shred a work and to break it down into its parts. So formalism is, in many ways, as far as literary criticism, the beginning, because you're looking only at what the author created, how well they did it. In many ways, it ties in more with the classical elements, like Aristotle's Poetics. What is the universal elements of it? So formalism, by its very nature, is the structure and the form of the poem or literature. This works for all of the creative arts. But when we start looking at some of the next ways that people were looking at literature, poetry, fiction in the 1950s, what we start seeing is a focus more on history. How can we bring in history to highlight what we're doing as far as, sorry about that, to highlight the work itself, to be able to look and see something like, can we truly read Mark Twain and not understand the history of the Mississippi in the 1850s, 1860s? So a lot of times the history itself can give ways of looking at it. Biography becomes important. And poets love to write about themselves, right? Well, I encourage people, if you can, write about other topics than yourself. People will love it. Objects, things, abstract, universals that we all go through, those are important. But when we start looking at this history, only at what was written, then bring in the history, then the biography's big weakness is we can't assume just because something happened in someone's life that there's a one-to-one relationship. Oh, this wife was a character or something like that. So that's a weakness of that biographical approach, is how things that happen may even subconsciously inspire, but we can't prove that one-to-one. So as we start looking into the 1960s, one of the things that is most probably impactful is a controversial one. It's the Marxist approach. And it's not so much looking at things to try to be communist, but looking at power structures, where the money goes, who's benefiting. And if you can't understand this Marxist viewpoint as far as trying to see how the power structures work, then you're probably going to have difficulties understanding feminism, LGBTQ things, anything that came after that, the colonial studies, because that is going to use these questions that the Marxists did for society in the same way. So I think that's a big problem that puts a separation between a lot of times people in the academy and writers and people who are reading and enjoying things for fun, is entertainment versus trying to break down and understand society. One of the interesting parts about the Marxist approach is oftentimes they're looking at the ideas, and this explains why a lot of the stuff we see on film, in poetry and fiction, it may not be that good, but it has an idea they want to get out there. So it may not be about the formal elements and the structure and how well it was done, but it's about, we want to get a new idea out into the discourse type thing. So these structural elements, we're going to use those no matter what we do. It is the essence of the poetry, right? The form, the rhythm, the structure. But by looking at what other people, how they may view it, how might that aid us in revisions, right? To be able to go back and say, oh, I said this, but how might it be received? Because a lot of times we may be broadcasting something, but what people are receiving and interpreting are very different. Have you ever done that? You were clear, you knew what you meant. People misinterpreted. So I encourage you, step back, slow down. I've been working on one book for 24 years. Someday it will be finished one way or the other, right? But I've rushed things before. And once you publish something and rush it, you can't unpublish it. It is done. Slow down, okay? Think about what you're doing. Read it aloud. Get other perspectives. But if you start thinking more about the sounds, the rhythm, the beauty of the words themselves, it's going to elevate any sort of genre fiction you do. It's going to make what you do more literary. So I don't know how much time we have. I can blather a long time, but I would really love to make this more of a discussion and get questions and things from you so that we can have more of a dialogue. Are there any things you would like for me to go more depth on, or something you'd like to? Yes, ma'am.
I studied literary criticism back when I was before I studied. What about deconstructionism as it regards to poetry? I just wondered about that.
Wow, you're psychic. That's my least favorite, simply because so often when I argue it or discuss things with deconstruction. What was that? Oh, I'm sorry. She was asking about deconstruction. And the reason I don't care for deconstruction, when I was in graduate school, so many of my peers were deconstructionists. And what they want to do is say, you didn't say that. What does that mean about you? Well, to me, it means I didn't want to talk about that. But they're looking for inconsistencies and ironies. And were you really saying the opposite of what you meant? And to me, so much of it becomes word games. A few times, I am from Alabama. I had to take deep breaths not to, it can be very annoying when it becomes semantics at a certain point.
As a reader, it's annoying.
Oh, as a reader, as a writer, but to me, when I was trying to defend my own work and they're saying, well, you didn't use this word at all, what does that mean? And to me, that means I didn't want to use that word, but they would try to infer things and imply. Deconstruct, it's not my favorite. I think there are better tools for literary criticism and to aid our writing.
It's just like the irony part of it. That's the only
I like irony.
That's the only part of it I liked is the irony. But I wonder because I never thought about it as regarding poetry, only as other, literary works.
People need publications in the academic world. They will argue and write about anything. More questions or observations? Yes, sir. I saw your hand first.
Early on in the first poetry that I was exposed to was the story of Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
And after that, it became like the rules of the game was in the 17th century, 16th century. And then when we were down in the 20th century, all the rules have gone away. So what's the future of poetry?
That's an excellent question. Are you talking about expression or art? That's what I always go back to. Expression, we've never had more opportunities, especially in the West, to be able to get our ideas, what we feel, what we think, out to an audience in almost immediate time. So people can say whatever they want. As far as quality, how we judge things has become so diffused and diverse with all of these different forms of literary criticism. Who am I to say that something's good, right? And so it's very difficult now to make a value judgment, and we've gotten away in many instances from the things from like Greco-Roman culture that were rediscovered in the Renaissance that made things so great. The universal elements, symmetry, the beauty, trying to make something that's going to stand the test of time rather than personal expression, trying to get your ideas out there. Or, there's a whole lot of I don't want to say solipsism, but writers love to talk about themselves, right? And so the more you write about yourself, is that necessarily what other people want to read or hear? And so that's what I'm always talking about when I'm revising. Okay, I got my idea, but is it the best way to say it? Yes, Mr. Kit.
That's an interesting point about who are you writing for? Because I gave a speech one time at my middle school I was teaching at, and I had written it like a poem. They didn't know, but that's the way I wrote it, and so that's the speech I gave. And when I sent a copy of it to a friend, he said that every speech that Churchill gave was written as a poem. You can go online, you can see this. And that helped him deliver the speech in a way that he felt was more effective for his readers. So unless you're playing around online or digging around, you would never know this. And I never knew it. I just knew that for me to give a speech, it was easier for me to put it in a free verse format that helped me glance down and follow the train easier than what to print. So many times, particularly when we're dealing with posthumous works, that question hangs to me in the air. Who's this person writing for? Is he clarifying an idea for himself? Or does he want someone else to see it specifically that way for a reason? So.
Yeah, and that I find that inspiring, Kit, because that's in many ways how I encourage my students to do. I want them to think rhythmically, and I want them to cut out all the excess. Oftentimes our first drafts are exactly how we speak, and we fill in things with articulated pauses, and we run on, and how many times can we say that, right? And so I want people to come in and just strike things out and reduce and condense, because once again, to me, poetry, it's like 180 proof, right? We are condensing it down. We're getting rid of all the extra bits and running on, and I keep going back to blathering, but just going on beyond what is necessary. And the poetry, you're cooking it down into where every word has meaning and power. Cindy, I'm sorry, I saw Cindy first.
Which reminds me, and just from what Kit is saying, I enjoyed taking your class over at FIT, and we were talking about poetry, and even with all of the different forms of expression, one of the things that you said that stuck in my head the most was poetry is story. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, last week I was teaching Randall Jarrett's Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. And it's 5 lines, I think it's less than 40 words, but it tells a story of someone who was drafted more to went up, flew in the sub-freezing temperatures beneath the bomber, and at the end they washed him out with a hose. It tells a full story in 5 lines. So that's what I'm talking about. A lot of times we may write our first draft because something good or bad happened to us and we're inspired. But can we take that and then maybe change the person, third person? Can we make it and so it's not just about us, so that, I don't know, the more I cut myself out of stories, the older I get, to me, I think it becomes more accessible to others and they can read their own things more into it. The more it's about me, the less it's about you. Oh, yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask, how do you get better at metaphors? Because there was a writer that's very popular. I can't think of his name, I'm sorry. But he said once he took a poetry class, it really opened up his writing and made him more prolific. He's put out several books. I think Soldier Story might have been one of them. But he said it was the poetry class that helped open his eyes to literature, words, and how to really bring out a lot of feeling in his writing.
That's another excellent question, and I don't have an easy answer for that, but what I try to do, and I encourage everyone to do, is what the military calls situational awareness. Be in the moment and observe, and I'm always looking and trying to be aware of what's going on so that I am trying to see lessons in that. Confucius said he could learn anything from anybody. He learns the good, what to do from a good man, what not to do from the bad. So every situation you can learn. You can learn about the human condition, you can observe. And so I think it becomes a habit of mind. A great example I like to tell, helping sometimes helps. I was sitting around, I got a little pond in my backyard, and there's this ant floating there. And I'm like, I'm gonna help him. And I get a little pine twig and I get him and I put him up on the lily pad and a lizard jumps out and eats him. That's the type of thing that makes me think, what can I do? And so there's no good answer as far as metaphor, but I think the more that you're engaging with the natural world, you're looking and you're observing and you're trying to be in the moment, you're gonna learn lessons that you can, and ideas that you can pass on. Yes, sir.
When I write my street poetry in the hood, I feel like I'm living in a dream. It's totally different. The people going by, and I've been in jail and whatnot, and it's always like when I'm doing it, I'm in a dream. I'm in a movie, rather. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you ever had that.
Could you tell everybody what he said?
Basically, he was saying poetry, when he was writing, it's like you're in a dream. Is that what I took?
I'm living in a movie.
You're living in a movie. Well, I think a lot of people's first novels are them throwing themselves in a scenario and sort of role-playing through it. So I think that's very, very healthy to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes and to try to look at things from outside perspectives. The older I get, I know I don't know it all. And so what can I learn from others? How can I improve myself today? The autobiography of Ben Franklin, read it. It's not just about his life, it's about his constant daily self-improvement. And so to me, that's writing, and that whole dedication to the letters. It's a self-improvement, and it's a lifetime commitment. Yes, Ashley.
What book or book would you recommend for people who are starting out writing poetry?
What book?
Especially first poetry.
A single book. That is a very hard one.
Just a starting point.
A starting point?
We're all coming from different experiences.
Well, honestly, I would suggest the single best thing you could probably do, because if you're going to buy just a small book of poetry, it's probably going to be either by a single author or it may be thematically based. What I would recommend any of you do is go to a used bookstore or online and get like a freshman or sophomore college level intro to lit book. It's going to have the histories. It's going to have examples that fit that style. It's going to give you a multiplicity of things to study. And if you buy just one by a single author, when I first started playing guitar, I wanted to be the Beatles. Everything sounded like that for a while. So the more things you read, I think it's going to help you get closer to your own voice, and you're not going to be emulating the one you like best.
Thank you.
Excellent. More questions?
So if you're thinking that you want to be a songwriter,
Mm-hmm.
you would use a certain form of poetry. Is that true?
I don't know necessarily a certain form of poetry, but you would be thinking in terms of rhythm and rhyme.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I know there's different types of poetry, and I'm coming from a very, very basic level. So I know that some rhyme and some don't. But songs usually have some sort of rhyme.
It's like I was saying, I always want my songs to rhyme because I want the person who's half listened in the back to be able to jump in on the chorus and everybody sing. It's memorable, rhymes. How many of you hear a song, you hear one line of it, and then you know what the next line is because you've heard it and the rhyme's there, and it's like, it just takes you right to it. So it depends on what you want to do. Are you wanting to challenge your readers? Are you wanting to make it easy for them? A lot of it comes down to what your purpose and goal is.
I think that's really huge because just starting off with poetry, I was finding I'm singing them.
Yeah.
But that was more recent. And then, defining what kind of poetry you're writing. And I was just driving one day and I'm like, all of a sudden I put it to a tune. All of a sudden I put it to this. And then the words, which, yes, with songs, they do tend to rhyme, obviously for the hook and the beat and all that. And then as I started singing more and more of them, I thought I was a poet, but poet is this huge, massive umbrella. And I'm talking from the perspective of starting out.
Yeah.
For someone who hated poetry up until a couple of years ago, and now I can't stop writing. So it's so surreal to me, but then it was such a huge umbrella, and where do I fit in, and this and the other, and when I saw that, found myself singing them, I'm like, wait a minute, I think I'm more of a lyric, I think these might be songs. And then that funneled that definition, which then helped me write it out better, flesh them out for the purpose, for the end purpose, for the reader, also for the receiver. So I think that's huge too. Taking all of these things that you have mentioned, Marxism, not doing deconstruction, this and the other.
Now do it if you want.
Or do it. You might want to be that person that wants to, I'm going to do it, but defining that for yourself, I think is huge. Because it helps you funnel some of the other stuff out and helps you figure yourself out a little bit better. At least it worked for me.
You just, you made me think of something, and while I was thinking about what you said, it reminded me of something Kit said. Let me hit both of them real quick. Now, when I was a little kid and a song came on the radio, I would sing, but I would make up my own lyrics. To me, that's the easiest way to get into poetry, is make up your own words to existing melodies and rhythms. Go back to Ben Franklin, one way he became such a great writer, but he was completely self-taught. He worked in his brother's print shop, and as he's laying out other people's essays, he's soaking up the rhythms and the way they would flow, and he would write his own sentences, rewriting each word so he had their structure but his information. So take the greats and rework your own words. That you can't go wrong with that. Now, what I was inspired about what Kit said as far as the Winston Churchill. I'm pretty sure if you go back and look between the commas, that's iambic, right? That's probably some type of pentameter where it's like 10 beats. And so I want to go back and read and count.
Me too.
Okay, more questions? Kit?
Well, I'm going to address that point again because I never looked at it that way. What I looked at was the sound of the language. So when I'm getting ready to submit something, due to an embarrassing incident in college I won't go into, I never submit unless I have read it out loud to myself multiple times. And the closest comparison I can come to is that when my wife and I are dancing, people say that we're expert dancers. We don't know a dance step in the world. But they see us on the dance floor and we're moving with the music. And it's fun for us. So that when I'm reading out loud, it is my ears that are the judge. It is my ears that are hearing the story. And if something is inadequate in my description, it is my ears that are picking it up saying, I may have thought that I put that description down, but when someone hears it, and I'm just one, but when someone else hears it, they're going to hear what I'm hearing, and there is no description there.
Yeah.
And this scene is inadequate because of that. And so by the time I finish, it is like a dance because I can read it and there's not a thing that bumps, that slows me down to the flow of the language. And I go back to, I think it's Richard Lederer that talked about punctuation, the purpose of punctuation, and he was a primary grammarian in the United States for a number of years. And he said the purpose of punctuation is the clarification of language. And I had a student one time that turned in a paper that had, he just put a salt and pepper shaker of commas on it, and I just thought he was mad at the teacher. And so I asked him in the back of the room, read this to me, and he read it like a poem. And then I got tears in my eyes, and I understood what he was doing. I said, you got 4 months left in this class with me. All you have to do is turn in one essay that meets rules. And after that, I don't care because I like what you're doing, and you need to pursue that.
That's interesting. Now, I think a lot of what you're saying as far as the dance, that has to do with listening to others. I think most times people are ready to respond with their own thoughts and they're not really listening. But to truly open yourself up to the moment and be listening, whether it's a conversation or the nature around you, you're going to become better with the rhythm. Now, the other part, is everyone in here a native English speaker? You've been hearing English your entire life plus 9 months. The auditory skills you have to edit are very, very strong. You've been speaking and listening to English longer than you've been writing and reading it. If you only use your eyes, you're only using half of your skill set. If you don't read it, you're missing probably some awkward passages and phrases. You got to read it aloud. More questions, comments, observations, epiphanies, a song.
Observation?
Yes, sir.
So I at my work during lunch, I go to an online poetry site, and there's hundreds of subjects to pick from and hundreds of poems, and an incredible amount of them are human pain and loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
That surprised me. That's not what I'm looking at all. I'm looking at the language, but I was just surprised at how people were in pain and loneliness. I was shocked.
Well, they're writing from inspiration, an emotion so powerful that they're forced to put the words to the page. And how often...
That's the only outlet.
Yeah.
For pain. Because you feel sometimes when you're that distraught, you can only put it down on paper, you can't even speak it in some situations.
But if you're so happy, you're probably enjoying the moment. And you're not saying, oh, wow, I want to preserve this and I want to get this on. You're just happy that it's existing. So I think it's much easier to go into the dark places in that way, because when we're having a good time, we tend to enjoy it, but the bad stuff may stick with us. Rarely do you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about something great that happened 30 years ago, right? Yes, sir.
Tell me about Alabama poetry.
Alabama poetry? It's not what I do.
Tell me about it.
Is there any? Sorry.
There's every group. As far as Alabama,
Yeah, you're from Alabama. Tell me about it.
There's nothing worth sharing about Alabama and poetry in here in this group. It took me years to get beyond the things I was mistaught, and yes, it was something I overcame. More questions?
What's an example of something you were mistaught?
Anything having to do with race, humans, how to treat women. Yeah. Why they actually fought the war. There's a lot of stuff. I could go on and on. What was that?
It would make good poetry.
It would, but
I know.
I try,
You try to stay away from that.
well, what can I add? And at a certain point, if we're looking at it as far as expression, how long can you fight the same battles as far as art? People who have more to say have said it better. More questions, more comments. Yes, ma'am.
Just a comment about him saying and reminding us to slow down.
Yes.
When I first wrote my children's book,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, it was a year ago, January, it was written, the first draft was written in no time. I thought, wow, this is easy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and then the illustrator has taken a year, and I am so, again, because she's young, she's in school, she's involved, and I am so, so thankful that she made me slow down. So I would go back and read out loud and reread. I'm still editing them, you know, and my editor told me, you will be making those revisions right before it goes to print. So that's, I think, I don't know, but I think for me as a new writer, that's the best thing we could say to anybody, is to slow down.
Let me give you a funny story on this. The poet Homer, the one who sort of codified the Iliad and the Odyssey, those were oral traditions before that. And is this something he actually said or something that's attributed to him? We're not sure, but the story goes, he said, you can see any error in your work if you put the manuscript down for 10 years. I always tell my students, you don't have 10 years this semester, but start early enough, you have time to edit, and that you have time to think and process that it's what you wanted to say, that's the best way you said what your goal was. And at the end, to me, the most important thing is step back and see the gap between your original vision and whatever it is you actually put on the screen, because they're going to be different. And then to me, the goal then is try to make whatever it is you got on the page or on the screen in some way reach that original vision you had. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any benefit to a poet going to a writers' conference? Because there's different conferences, you know, in Florida and other places. Is there any benefit to that?
There can be. A lot of it, as the question was about going to writers' conferences and things, a lot of it depends on the particular conference, what the focus is. Is it encouraging young voices? Is it more like, oh, this is all about Ernest Hemingway? And so depending upon what it is and how far you travel and what the pricing is, sometimes they can be of great benefit, but do your research and find out if it is something that it's going to be worth the investment of time and money. Yes, sir.
I just have a comment on that in some ways. Probably the best thing to do is go to other people who are writing and present your own stuff. It makes you go over what you've written and you say, oh boy, I don't like that. I better change that before I bring it. And even what we're trying to do now is bring your errors so we can see what you thought was an error and how you corrected it. It may or may not make it better, but it's worth doing. And so you have to present it if you want to, because otherwise you'll be writing and it won't be meaning.
Embrace your failure. You learn by embracing your mistakes, and if you know a weakness and you make it and you embrace it, it's no longer a weakness, it becomes a strength. Yes, sir.
Recently I've been looking at how to develop a haiku, and it's supposedly 575, some kind of rules, whatever. Go on the internet, not one is 575.
Those aren't haikus. Those are people saying...
No, but supposedly they're the, quote, the best haiku in 2021.
On the internet. Here's something I always say to my students, and tomorrow night their poetry is due. So this is fresh. If you do open form, can you get it wrong?
No.
If you do a form that has specific rules, like a sonnet has 14 lines or a haiku, can you get it wrong? Yes. And so if you just want to embrace open form, this is my expression, you cannot get it wrong. But if you embrace pre-existing forms where there are expectations, you may violate those. So just be aware, if you're trying to work in a form, know the requirements. Yes?
I wrote a poem a few years ago, and it was called An Ode to the Post Office, and I was told that I did it all wrong. Is there a special format for odes? Because I'm an ignorant person.
Well, usually they're an extended meditation on a specific object or season or something like that. I would need to go back and look at the specific definition to make
sure. Just a big old thank you poem to the post offices.
Maybe they didn't like the content. Yes?
What would be like the major rule if you're critiquing a poem, somebody's poem? I mean, what would an editor or publisher kind of look at? Well,
a lot of it has to do, are they trying to do a specific form? If so, you can get that wrong. Are they trying to express themselves? Are they trying to go to a more universal artistic place? Can you take that poem and read it from one of those through one of those lenses of literary criticism where you get different interpretations by looking at it in different ways. Every critic is going to read it in a different way, and that's a whole Pandora's box trying to figure out what a specific critic wants. What I try to do is think once again about what I wanted, and then is this the best way that I could say it? And then at a certain point you have to stay close to your vision, because otherwise, if we want to write so that others understand us and we're communicating, but I don't want to change my message and write just so that I'm making people happy, right? We still want to challenge and to try to get people to think in different ways and perspectives. So how do we sort of value and coddle, and how do we challenge at the same time? Yes, Cindy.
In addition to, the Florida Writers Association is in the middle of their RPLA awards right now, and poetry is one of the genres. So I've been a judge for them for a couple of years, and this year I asked if I could be a judge for poetry. So they give each poem a list of 10 criterion to try, for us to try to judge them, and some of them are voice, form, and does that form complement the subject of the poem or not, and if so, can you give enhancement opportunities? So there are certain criteria that you're watching, and I love this comment that you made about form, because if you don't do 575 in haiku, then it isn't haiku, and so if you're saying that what it's going to be, then have it be what it's going to be. Have a good voice and tell a good story, and do the form, and does it complement what you're trying to say? There's 5 others, and I'm sorry I can't remember them off the top of my head, but there's certain things to follow that they do judge on. If you ever want to go on their site, the Florida Writers Association, I think their rubrics may be available.
It is. I just got it. It is,
Cool.
yeah.
More questions? Yes, sir.
Any of your students use AI for poetry?
Do they do what?
Use AI?
Well, according to the Turnitin analytical tool I use, no, but are they using something that was invented yesterday by a 19-year-old that I haven't discovered as far as AI detection? Maybe. I'm constantly fighting the dike with the holes in it, plugging it, and every time they create a new tool, they create a new thing to detect it, and someone's going to work around with that. It's a never-ending battle.
Thank you.
More questions or comments? Well, this has been great, great fun. I hope you found it enjoyable. I could talk about this stuff all day. And my goal is, starting in January, I'm going to, once a month, have a 2-hour intensive workshop at the Florida Tech campus. But I was wanting to start it in August, but my wife wants to do some traveling this fall. So I'm going to have to.
In January?
It'll be in January. I'll let every. Yes.
Is that open to it?
Well, what I was hoping to do was to take 10 or 12 people and keep it small enough that we can provide substantive feedback and be both a mini lecture followed by workshopping.
So it's not, you don't have to be a student of it?
Oh, no. This will be for the community, but I just want to get like 10 or 12 people and keep it a hardcore group so that we learn, we can establish relationships, that we feel comfortable enough sharing our work. And I want, people who are really, really into poetry. I love poetry. More questions and comments?
Anyone else? Anything?
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you